it's hard to understand per se. First of all, it doesn't seem very sexy, does it? Bioethics. Ew. What is that? That sounds like a class like you have to take to graduate. But you will see how relevant this is as we progress. Before we get too far into things, though, I want to take just a moment and say a prayer. So if you'll pray with me. Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this time. Thank you, God, that you are a God who engages us in our minds, as well as our hearts and as well as our souls. We pray that as we explore new territories, as we seek out your will and your word in uncharted areas of life, we pray, Lord, that you would be with us, that we would walk humbly and fearfully, always seeking to do your will before our own. And we just ask all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. What bioethics entails, and I entitled this Brave New World for a reason. How many of you have read Brave New World by Aldous Huxley? Sometimes it was required. Usually George Orwell's 1984 or Huxley's Brave New World. One or the other is required reading in high school at some point in time. Now, more people seem to be familiar with Orwell. The idea that Big Brother, right, you have government controlling, enforcing uniformity upon the populace. Okay, if you remember that, there's the doublespeak and the idea that you can control people's thoughts by controlling the history and controlling the language, right? We're all familiar with that. And a lot of people feel that that is a reflection of today. However, I really think we're closer to Huxley's view than to Orwell's view. Because Orwell's view was a top-down, government-driven, what they call dystopian future, a future where everything is perfectly managed but controlled. However, Huxley's view was a bottom-up one. It wasn't that the government wanted to control everybody. In fact, that there were people who lived outside of this dystopian system. They were called savages. John was the savage that Bernard Marx brings back. But in Huxley's version, it is the populace who wants to be pleasured all the time. They want the things that they want. They've completely divorced the idea of reproduction from what it means to be human or civilized. Everybody's clamoring for their soma. It's the drug of choice. Now, today the drug of choice is independence and happiness. But Huxley's view is much more interesting, and I think it's actually much more fitting to where we are today, because people don't want to think, they don't want to be, introspective about what they can do. They just want to run headlong into technology and not worry about it. And that's where I think we are today, especially in some of the medical and reproductive fields. And you can see that clearly. I mean, for example, California, governor just signed the law allowing physician-assisted suicide, right? I mean, we're in it. We're here right now. How do we deal with that? Is that even right? Is that problem? People were arguing it on moral grounds. It's always interesting. I noticed that the Los Angeles Times will run articles on some of the difficulties and the issues that position raises, but they'll only run them after the law passes. They'll never ask those questions beforehand. Seems slightly slanted to me. So these issues will affect us, and they'll affect us in very specific ways. And I find many times that Christians not only don't understand them, sometimes Christians are complicit in disobeying what God's will would be because they don't have enough data. And especially with cases like surrogacy and stuff like that, and we'll get to that. First of all, I want to start off by I'm going to give you my premise. This is the basis upon which I'm basing our entire talk. And really all of bioethical issues need to start from some platform. This is my platform, that all human beings have intrinsic value. Every human being has intrinsic worth, no matter what their physical abilities, and no matter what their mental abilities hold. So, someone who is born with Down syndrome is just as human, is just as valuable as the mathematician at the local university. Okay? The Olympic athlete may be a valuable human being, but he is just as valuable as the quadriplegic or the thalidomide baby. It is not our physical or mental degree of independence that defines our value. It's the fact that we are created by God. And because of this, our choices in how we treat people, especially the most vulnerable among us, matters. Now, I'm going to start off with the easiest case that we have to deal with, and that's abortion. Abortion is easy, I say, because it's pretty clear-cut that the fetus itself is not requesting to be aborted. It's pretty clear-cut that it's an issue that has gotten a lot of headlines. It's gotten a lot of visibility. We all know about it. We may not know some of the facts or how to argue effectively for it, and that's really what I'm going to touch in on. And then we'll get into others. And I'm going to leave a lot of time for Q&A. So, write down, hopefully I'll leave a lot of time for Q&A. This, as I explore these issues, each one of them becomes a Pandora's box in their own right. So we'll go through there. But first of all, let's talk about abortion. What's the current state? The Guttmacher Institute put these numbers together. And for who has abortions, first of all, half of all pregnancies to American women are unintended. So 1 out of 2 pregnancies that occur to American women are not an intended pregnancy. Of those unintended pregnancies, 4 in 10 end in abortions, 40%. That's a bunch. So if you do your math, that's 20% of all pregnancies, intended or not, end in abortion, 1 out of 5. About half of American women have experienced some kind of unintended pregnancy over the course of their life, and 3 in 10 will have an abortion by the age of 45. 30% of American women will have an abortion by the age of 45. Now, in a church our size, what do you conclude from that? There are a lot of women going to this church who either have had an abortion or may get into a position where they panic and choose abortion. And how is the church talking to them? Big question. Overall, unintended pregnancy rates have actually stagnated and started to decline in the past decade. Yet, unintended pregnancy increased by 29% among poor women, while decreasing 20% among higher income women. So those in lower socioeconomic classes are seeing abortion much more readily available. They're actually getting abortions more often, even though abortion overall is dropping. And that's because all of the women in higher socioeconomic classes are choosing to not abort. Part of that, I think, is due to there's much less stigma today to be a single mother than there was in the past. I think that's part of the issue. In 2011, for example, 1.06 million abortions were performed in that year alone. That's down from 1.21 million abortions in 2000, and it was 1.31 million in 1997, I believe. So it's going down a little bit, but still 1 million lives, babies, killed in 2011. And again, these statistics are a few years old because those are the best results we have. Each year, 1.7% of women age 15 to 44 have an abortion. Half have had at least one previous abortion. 9 in 10 abortions occur in the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. Now, 90% happen within the first trimester. That means that 10% don't. Now let's put two statistics together. 1.06 million abortions. What's 10% of 1 million? 100,000 abortions a year are second or third trimester abortions. 100,000. 100,000 of them. Late-term abortion is not a, quote, rare thing. Yes, it's significantly smaller than the abortions as a whole, but 100,000 second and third term abortions are pretty big. 18% of U.S. women attaining abortions are teenagers. So of the 20% of pregnancies that in abortion, 1 in 5 of the people who have abortions are teenagers. Close to 1 in 5, 18%. 15 to 17-year-olds make up 6%. 18 to 19-year-olds make up 11%. Teens younger than 15 make up 0.4%. So it's not 12 to 14 as much. They're still there. But really the bulk of abortions are women in their 20s. They account for more than half of all abortions. Women who are not worried that their dad is going to kick them out of their house. They're independent women, which means that abortion is a choice that can be managed. It's not going to interfere with, say, their ability to graduate high school if it's women in their 20s. Well, why do these women have abortions? What do they say? Well, 75%, 3/4 of them, mention some concern for or responsibility to some other individual. I got to take care of my wife, my mother, my husband, that kind of thing. 75% also say they can't afford a child. So you see there's multiple reasons why folks give on this. Also, 3 out of 4 say that having a baby would interfere with work, school, or the ability to care for dependents. Well, yeah, you have a baby, and guess what's going to happen? There's more work involved, absolutely. And half say they don't want to be a single parent, or they're having problems with their husband or partner, and this would just complicate things. Now, of these are the vast majority of reasons why folks have an abortion. Can you imagine? Think back to a lady named Susan Smith. Do you remember Susan Smith? Susan Smith was a figure from the 1990s who went on national television crying, saying her car was carjacked, and she blamed a black man who had stolen it with her 2 children, 3 and 1.5, strapped in the back. And for 5 or 6 days, the press was looking for this carjacker. Or maybe it wasn't even 5 or 6 days. They found the car in a lake with the children dead inside from drowning. It turns out that Susan Smith herself strapped her children into the car seats and let the car drive into the lake and manufactured the story because her boyfriend that she had at the time didn't necessarily want the children as part of their relationship, and she was trying to do what she could to make that relationship work. That reasoning is the same reasoning I see here. Would anybody, or did anybody, excuse Susan Smith for her actions? No, she was vilified, and rightly so. But are any of these reasons then worthwhile reasons to kill a child who's already been born? And I would think it's clearly the answer is no. So why would these reasons be viewed by the ladies who are offering them as legitimate for killing children who just happen not yet to be born? And it's because we have made abortion an easy out by assuming that if we can't see it, it doesn't count. It's just a medical procedure. The only people that count are the people that we can see. And that's the problem. That's the big problem with abortion. We don't understand the humanity of the unborn child. So, how do we get that idea across? There's a way to do it without causing friction. Now, I know when we try to discuss abortion, it can be a little bit difficult. You hear all kinds of objections, and I'm going to mention a few, but there are more. I wanted to keep it short today. But let me give you a tactic that you can use first, and this is known as the SLED argument. It's a nice little acronym that you can remember, the SLED argument. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to define the unborn child as a human being. Now, I try to be very careful in my explanation. For example, if you start defining personhood, that can be considered subjective. You have philosophers like Peter Singer who don't believe that children are persons even after they're born because they don't have certain cognitive abilities yet. I think Singer's wrong. I think most people think Singer's wrong. But if you start arguing human versus person, that becomes a little bit of a sticky wicket. What you do know, and what science can prove to us, is all human beings had their beginning as a fertilized egg. Every single one. When the egg is fertilized, what do we know? There is a new set of chromosomes, 23 pair, right? It can be male or female. From the first time, from cell 1 to when it starts to divide by mitosis, it is a start. And there is a progress, there is a growth that happens. And just like any growth, just like any living organism that matures, you add abilities and function as you grow. But the identity of the thing, a sapling is still an oak. It's an oak sapling, right? An oak acorn is still an oak. There's still the potential for an oak tree. Once it begins growing, it has that potential. So a fertilized egg is a human being. There's no other. Matter of fact, all the medical textbooks say this. Now, you may hear in the debates on television with the different political pundits, and I've watched television reporters say this. Oh no, science is unresolved on this. No, science is not unresolved on this. All of the biology textbooks say all human beings have their beginning as a fertilized egg. From that point on, there is one thing that is growing. And what is that thing? It is a human being, even if it's down to a single cell. So how do we argue this? We argue this through the SLED argument. Number one, does size determine whether a person is a human being or not? Does size determine it? Well, let's find this out. Do humans lose their value when they don't look right? I mean, do those who suffer from dwarfism become less human as adults than those who are 6 foot tall? Does that make sense? Men are larger than women. Does that make men more human or more of a person than a woman? Of course, I don't think that people would believe that Shaquille O'Neal is somehow 30% more of a person than Hillary Rodham Clinton, right? Because he's that much larger than her. This kind of bigotry based on the size of the individual is really what causes the destruction of groups of people based on some really arbitrary piece of physical appearance. Why does size matter? Size doesn't matter in defining what a human is. Human values transcend physical appearance. Not looking right, not being the right size. You can immediately see that that's biased. It shouldn't disqualify a human being from being valuable. So size. What about the level of development, though? It's not merely that the fetus is small. The fetus is not capable of living outside the womb, right? Its level of development is still very rudimentary. Matter of fact, in the first trimester, not everything's formed. They don't even have eyelids sometimes, all these kinds of things. Well, then you have to ask, isn't that qualification then just saying a human being is one based on his abilities, what he can or can't do? Do we forfeit our rights as human persons based on the fact that others have more capabilities than we do? Does a 5-year-old who has a level of development much lower, no, they don't have abstract reasoning capabilities, for example. A 5-year-old left, what would happen if we leave a 5-year-old home alone for a week? There was just a lady in Whittier, I think, who left her 2 children home alone while she went off on a vacation for a week, and she was arrested for it. Are we endangering those kids' lives? Is it okay because they have fewer abilities than the adults, so they're really less of a person than the adult, And they can't feed themselves, but that just shows that their developmental abilities are fewer than ours, so therefore they're less of a person than us. No, nobody would buy that. When they start sentencing that lady, they're going to say, you're putting human lives in danger, right? That's what we would say. We would argue that. Human value transcends the abilities or lack of abilities. Missing abilities can't disqualify a person as being human. But it's not merely the fact that they're small and they don't have certain abilities. It's where they're located. They live inside the mother. Now this starts to bring over the whole question of, a woman's right over her body. But let's set aside some of that, and we'll get to that a little bit later. The ultimate question we're asking is not whether the woman has certain rights over her body. The first question we're asking is the fetus a human being? Does it qualify? Because it has to live in a certain environment, does that mean that that fetus forfeits its worth as a human being? Well, baby Rachel was born prematurely at 24 weeks. She weighed only 1 pound 9 ounces, and she soon dropped under 1 pound after she was born. She was so, a matter of fact, we have a person who actually fellowships here. Daniel is now, I think 16, 15, something like that. He was a 1 pound baby. And I remember his mom going through this, and it was an amazing thing that the doctor saved him. But here is someone whose environment changed from, say, a fetus. He should have been 3-4 more months inside the womb, right? I think he was born like 4 months premature. Did that movement from inside the womb to outside the womb fundamentally change his human nature, the fact that he's a human being? Does that make sense? Do people who have, if this living baby, baby Rachel that I was talking about, who was under 1 pound, she could fit in a doctor's hand. If the doctor had crushed her because the environment in which she was born into wouldn't sustain her, right? She couldn't live outside of, as a normal infant would live. She has to be put in an incubator and have to feed her oxygen and do all this stuff. If the doctor had crushed her instead because the environment was unsuitable for her, as it would be for an infant, would the doctor be killing a human being or something else? I think he would be held as a murderer, and I think we would rightly be justified in. This is why these Planned Parenthood videos that are coming out now are so egregious. And I don't have any of them. I'm not showing any of them. You guys, I'm sure you've heard all about them. You can go check them out. But when they're talking about babies being born alive, this is what they're talking about. When they're talking about cutting them open and extracting organs from them, this is the kind of thing that they're talking about. If this same little girl was inches away from outside the womb, resting inside her mother's room, she could be legally killed from abortion, yet the difference of a few moments in the fact that she's sitting outside the womb instead of inside the womb, and all of a sudden it's murder. Changing locations is trivial morally. It doesn't make any sense to say the location you once were makes you non-human and the location you are now makes you human. There's something just flawed in that fundamentally. Environment has no bearing on who we are. Lastly, what about degree of dependency? The fact that fetuses require a placenta, they require a mother, they require an umbilical cord. There is no way, shape, or form they could ever live by themselves. Well, the unborn's dependency on his mother for sustenance is really irrelevant to the baby's value, because if you think about it, even born children are completely dependent upon their mother's sustenance, right? Well, we now have baby formula. Prior to that, we would nurse our children, and if we didn't nurse our newborn infants, they would die. We have dialysis patients, or patients who use heart-lung machines, or pacemakers. We have a lot of different people who, if left to their own environment, or left to their own selves, they are dependent upon outside sources, mechanical machines, in order to keep themselves alive. We don't say, well, we can go ahead and knock off all the kidney dialysis guys because they're obviously not human. They have to hook themselves up to a machine. It doesn't make sense. If we decide that degree of dependency is a criteria for what makes someone human or non-human, you can see how that would really cause a big concern in the Americans with Disabilities councils and things like that. All physically dependent people are at risk if degree of dependency determines their value. Insulin, right? Diabetes folks, I mean, take your pick. And even if you undergo general surgery, you are to some degree dependent upon those machines, especially if you have heart bypass. So do you stop being a human being when you're having open heart surgery and then start being one again when they remove the machine? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. So the SLED argument says that these are the 4 areas by which those who support abortion try to dehumanize the fetus: size, level of development, environment, or degree of dependency. And in all 4 areas, they fail. Because there's no other case where one can point to say, yes, this is a consistent rule to which we should apply. So, now you don't have to go through all of this when you're talking to people. What you have to do is do a little tactic that I've been kind of doing throughout the whole thing. This is Scott Klusendorf's tactic, and he came up with the SLED argument. Life Training Institute is Scott Klusendorf's organization. If you want to get some really good pro-life training, see some videos, great place to go. But what Scott says is anytime you're engaging, there's only one question in the abortion debate. Is the fetus a human being? If the fetus is a human being, then that changes the debate no matter what the objection. So what we have to do is we have to define the fact that the fetus is a human being, and then we can meet the objections by doing the second step, which is trotting out the toddler. So whenever you encounter objection to banning abortion, just pull out a 2-year-old and say, does the same thing apply to the 2-year-old? So for example, a woman should have a right to control her own body. This is probably one of the most consistently used arguments on the pro-abortion side. Well, that's true. Did the mother in Whittier have a right to her own body to go wherever she desired? Well, yeah, U.S., right? The Constitution would say you have a personal. Did that right extend to her with her children left at home then? Or did she do something criminal by exercising a right over her own body to go away for the weekend? Did Susan Smith have a right to do whatever she wanted with her body? Not when that right infringes upon the lives of her children. So, first of all, you got to be careful because the first question in this, really it begs the question, a woman has a right to her own body. Is it only her body we're talking about, or are there 2 bodies involved? Okay, a pregnant woman, how many hands and how many feet? 4 hands, 4 feet, right? 20 fingers, 20 toes. 10 for the fetus, 10 for the mother. So a woman may have a right to do whatever she wishes with her own body until that infringes upon the life of another, even if that other is her own child. Arguing abortion is justified because a woman has a right to control her own body assumes there's only one body involved. But that's the point that we're trying to argue about. Okay? But women would be unsafe. What about all those back alley abortions that happen? You don't want women dying by the thousands, do you? Well, be careful here. There's 2 pieces at play. First of all, it's not necessarily clear that these so-called coat hanger abortions were as prevalent as the pro-abortion side makes it out to be. The records tend to show a diminishing return. For example, in the 1960s, most abortions were done by licensed medical physicians in good standing. They would just do this procedure on the sly. So it wasn't that you're going to some guy with a dirty knife, right? The Dirty Dancing scenario where the girl gets all sick. Why did they put that in the movie? They were trying to make a political point. In 1970, I believe, which was the last year they had records for, or 1971. Remember, Roe versus Wade was passed in 1972. They said that there had been reported 40 abortions using substandard practices and procedures across the country. That number had been diminishing because it wasn't necessarily the case that that was happening over and over again. So that's the first question. But even so, side effects don't determine the moral justification of a procedure. My gosh, how many of you have watched any kind of television where they start advertising, right, all the different prescription drugs? And they say, the side effects are longer than the rest of the commercial, for example. I was watching a video yesterday where they had some Irish audiences watch American television commercials, and what they would show them is they would show them some of these different commercials. And people are going like, death? You know, oh yeah, oh your psoriasis, your itchy skin, that's a problem, but side effects could include death? I think I'd take the itchy skin, right? Now, I make fun of that because obviously those side effects aren't guaranteed, and if you understand the way medical research works, if anybody died and they just happened to be part of the test group, you have to include that as a possibility, even though it's not necessarily a probability. Now, if they died from an accident, if the piano fell on them, you're not going to read on the side of the bottle, caution, piano may fall on you. You know, there's some, but when you see that long list of side effects, you got to remember that there's not necessarily an indication that that pill caused that side effect. It's just that the person in the part of that test group, maybe it's one out of a 2,000 person study, but one person showed and exhibited these signs, and the FDA then requires you to list it as part of that possible connection. But regardless, it doesn't mean that women who seek to break the law and have a bad side effect, right? In other words, killing your child is not a better option than having a side effect of a back alley abortion. Marianne Warren pointed out, quote, "The fact that restricting access to abortion has tragic side effects does not in itself show that the restriction to abortion is unjustified. Murder is wrong regardless of the consequence forbidding it." So the fact that women may violate, if abortion were illegal today, the fact that certain women may go to back alley abortions, that doesn't mean that the law restricting abortion is wrong. It means that the women doing the back alley abortion are endangering their lives and should be cautioned not to do that, right? If you say, well, you know, the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit may endanger certain people who need to get to the hospital, well, that may be true, but we don't pass the law based on the fact that every once in a while somebody may need to speed. It doesn't make sense. Well, no one really knows when life begins. You know, we don't really know. That's actually not true. We do know when life begins. Like I said, it begins at conception. That's pretty easy. But even if we assume that, if you see a room and you're not sure if there's a 2-year-old in that room, do you throw a hand grenade in that room? No. So if you don't know when life begins, why do you assume abortion is the first step? It's like throwing a hand grenade in a room with a 2-year-old. If you wouldn't do it with a 2-year-old, why would you do it there? What about rape and incest? What about those? Well, those are tragic circumstances, I agree. But extreme cases are not the way to set precedent. Extreme cases make bad precedent. But if I were to show you a 2-year-old who was the product of rape, is it okay to kill that 2-year-old now? Does that make any sense at all? Of course not. What about incest? I mean, we have several people who are the products of incest. It's a very rare commodity. It's a very rare situation where children are conceived. Matter of fact, the interesting thing about incest is what we're finding out is most Planned Parenthood clinics will not report the perpetrator who gets a young girl pregnant via incest, because the Planned Parenthood will lose the ability. What they're finding is those incestuous relationships where the stepfather is sexually abusing the daughter and things like that, they come in for 2, 3, 4 abortions. And Planned Parenthood says nothing. So Planned Parenthood would rather let the sexual abuse of the child continue than report as their right, as they're mandated by law to do, to the proper authorities. How should a civil society treat innocent human beings that remind us of any painful event? Should the lady who stole, the adulterous lady who stole the husband, should the wife be allowed to kill her because she's a lifelong reminder of that painful experience? Of course not. Are there any other cases where, having been victimized yourself, you can justly turn around and victimize a third party who has no direct, wasn't directly responsible for the event? Remember, the child, the baby, is a product of the bad act. It is not victimizing you, him or herself. So I don't think rape and incest is a fair objection, and I think we need to talk about it. Now that pushes forth, and I'm going to be cautioning you. You will see certain legislators step up and try to pass very restrictive abortion laws, and they will make an exception for rape and incest. Okay, they'll make an exception for that. Is that wrong? Well, in a perfect world, probably. But this is the political system, and sometimes you got to give it. Remember, most abortions are not from rape and incest, probably less than 0.5%. Is it better to pass legislation that saves, what did we say, 100,000 second and third term trimester abortions, 100,000 babies a year? Having a rape and incest clause, which will probably not affect any of those late term abortions anyway, most of those would happen in the first 12 weeks. And just to have that on the books so it's politically viable, yeah, I'd take that. I'd take saving 100,000 babies a year, even if it has the rape and incest clause, because without the law, we're killing the rape and incest babies, and we're killing all the other babies besides. So sometimes we have to make political compromises heading toward the perfect ideal, but not necessarily getting there on the first jump. But what about all these unwanted children? All you pro-lifers, all you want to do is save the baby. And then once it's born, you walk away and you leave it. Well, that's, first of all, patently false. Crisis pregnancy centers, and I know of several, even in the local area, do not stop caring for the mother or the child once the baby's born. Matter of fact, one of the things they do the most is provide free diapers, provide strollers, provide clothing. They build that relationship after the child is born. One person had said, quote, "I don't think anybody has the right to object to abortions unless they're willing to take care of all the unwanted children brought into the world if abortion was made illegal." Oh, okay. Well, I don't think anyone has the right to complain about homelessness unless they are willing to bring in all of the homeless people due to the current existing homeless laws. What are you doing to help? Should we kill the homeless children since, they're suffering and they're unwanted? Does that make sense? So we bring out the toddler. We trot out the toddler. We say, does the same objection, does the same scenario work with a 2-year-old that it does with an unborn child? And if it doesn't hold, then what that tells you is that their ethical guideline, whatever their objection is, fails. It's the ethics itself that has the problem. It's not the fact that the pro-life person is being bigoted or something like that. It's that their ethical system is inconsistent. If you could come up with some. Now, what about if the life of the mother's in danger? Okay, that is a possibility that happens. Ectopic pregnancies are the primary issue when we look at here. And when the life of the mother's in danger, then we have difficult choices to make. And we have to weigh the consequences. If the mother dies while the child is in utero, the odds are that the child will probably die as well. So if we do nothing, the child may die. What if the mother has cancer and she needs chemotherapy treatments? That could harm the child. Do you, A, keep the child and subject him to radiation, which may deform the child. B, abort the child so that you know that you won't have a child born with these deformities due to the chemoradiation. Or C, avoid the radiation altogether until the child is delivered at, say, 36 weeks, and then get on the chemo. And a lot of women have opted for option C because they feel that the life that they're giving, the life that they're providing for, is actually, they're mothers, right? This is what mothers do. They sacrifice for their children. And that's kind of built into them. That's what we want to see. That's how people are wired. And they now, saying that, I don't think it's necessarily morally wrong for a woman to have to, especially like I said, in ectopic pregnancies where it could, literally the pregnancy itself could kill her. If it's one or the other, what are we going to do? We have the same problem with Siamese twins. So let's take it out of the womb. What if we have Siamese twins where one has a very weak heart, very weak body functioning system, but separating the two could kill the weaker one, or may almost certainly kill the weaker one? Well, if you don't, the heart of the stronger one is going to give out. And these are ethical dilemmas that physicians face, and by and large, they have considered it the ethical thing to do to separate them and let nature take its course, or basically let God do what God wills in that, because otherwise you're subjecting them both to a death sentence. So there's an outside scenario that matches with the inside scenario. It's not a pleasant thing. Nobody wants to see their twin sister to whom they were attached die because you had to separate them. But there's what better option is there? If there's no better option, that's what you have to do. Similarly, when you have a mother and an unborn child, separating them because of the danger is not necessarily morally ambiguous or morally wrong. Does that make sense? So, when you're talking about abortion, trot out the toddler. Trot out the toddler. Okay. We've got a lot in the second half. I'm wondering if I should take a break here. Take any questions you have on abortion, any other objections you may have heard, and then I'm going to jump into reproductive assisted technologies and things like that after the break when we'll have it. So do you have any questions now on this? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
They also say they killed two people because they consider the child to be...
This is a legal question, not an ethical question, but yes, that's a great question. And what Beverly has asked is, aren't there certain situations, especially within the law, that we can point to where, say, a drunk driver or someone driving recklessly slams into a pregnant mother and the mother dies as a result of it? If the mother is pregnant, the homicide laws are written in such a way that you can charge the driver with 2 counts of negligent homicide, one for the mother and one for the unborn child. That is true. That happens in many different states. And this shows some of the schizophrenia that surrounds the abortion debate, because the abortion debate has been highly politicized. It is more a political debate than an ethical debate at this point. The pro-life side would argue about the personhood, the humanity of the fetus, but those who argue for abortion, as we heard Cecile Richards and everybody else say that, it's just a thing, it's not a human being, it's no big deal, it's tissue that we're donating and things like that, unless the attitude of the mother is it's wanted. Then all of a sudden the attitude of the mother reflects upon the fetus, and now because you killed that fetus without the mother wanting it to die, it becomes a homicide. Now, name for me any other aspect where I say, well, I wanted that property, so now that's my property, but if I don't want it, it's yours. Legal standing doesn't work in those ways. It's not based on, personhood. Humanity is not based on one's desire. Heck, that was the argument for slavery. They're not people. We don't want them to be people, therefore they are not people, and that was inherently absurd. So yes, this is one of the ways, because for those individuals who want their children, justice screams out to be done. This is one of the problems that we have. People rise up with a guy who kills a woman is one thing. A guy who stabs a pregnant woman in the belly in order to slay her fetus, shouldn't that be homicide and can be treated as such? Absolutely. Absolutely. And like I say, the public would be aghast if you didn't deal with it that way. The problem is now that with 40 years later and so much is known and so much has been argued that you have real smart pro-abortion lawyers who try to argue around that by showing different precedents. So the court has one precedent on abortion focusing solely on the desires of the mother. The court has another precedent focusing on the fact that that fetus would be a baby and would have a life. And those two come in conflict all the time, and depending on what the actual court case is, they fight against each other all the time. Yes, but that's a great observation. Other questions? See, abortions, this is actually, believe it or not, the easiest of the topics, but it is also the most crucial for us to get our feet underneath, because 1 million babies a year. It is the biggest moral crisis facing this country, bar none, bar none. There is no other moral crisis worse than this one. Clay Jones, who was here the first week, mentioned that we talk about, like the Assyrians would take the babies of the enemies whom they conquered, and they would throw them up and catch them on their spear. Or burn them in the arms of Molech, right? And we talk about the Canaanites and the hideousness of that. But aren't we doing the same thing? Sure, we don't use a bronze statue. We use a surgeon's scalpel. We use saline solution to burn the child instead of fire. So what? The method doesn't matter. It's the end result. A living human being is dying. And we are no better than the ancients in that heinousness. We've just repackaged it because now it's out of sight, out of mind. And that's why ultrasounds have been playing such a huge part in crisis pregnancy centers. Because when pregnant women see their children in utero, especially 4D ultrasounds, huge deal, right? The 3D kind that you can see, as opposed to, sometimes ultrasounds are real hard to read. They're kind of blotchy, but if you see the three-dimensional rendering, a lot of them will change their minds right on the spot. And as the technology grows, as you've seen friends and family who've had these 3D ultrasounds, it's pretty hard to argue that that's not a human being in there. I mean, they suck their thumb, you see all the things, the yawning in utero, all these things that are mundane but obviously human. Obviously human, and ultrasounds have been a big part of that. So, okay, I'm going to give you guys 10 minutes real quick. We'll be back at 3:43. And pick up where on this one. Reproductive technologies are very, very new, relatively speaking, in the course of humanity. You have Louise, the test tube baby, right? The first test tube baby was born in Britain in 1978, first in vitro fertilized child. So that begins the point at which these technologies start. And just like all of medicine, as we become more familiar with these certain aspects and as there's money to be made, I think those two pieces are necessary. The first is that we have to become more knowledgeable. But part of what pushes our knowledge is the fact that there's a profit out there. There's a lot of people who can't get pregnant who want to be pregnant. There's a lot of people who can't get pregnant who want to be pregnant, and they are willing to pay for it. Given those two factors, the reproductive technology area of medicine has exploded and given us quite a few different kinds of technologies that we can do. Now, when we talk about reproductive technologies, like I said, there's a wide swath and there's a wide moral understanding of each of those. They don't all necessarily fit nicely into one bucket. So the first one would be, say, fertility medications. Okay? Maybe, for example, a woman who doesn't ovulate very consistently might take fertility drugs to cause ovulation. That's one type of technology. I see this not necessarily outside of the realm of any other kind of medicine, where if you don't produce insulin very well, you can take some insulin, right, externally, in order to help your body maintain itself in that kind of a system. So, for example, fertility medications, to some degree, are not necessarily morally ambiguous. I think they're pretty straightforward. The problem becomes, if you take fertility medication, you have to be monitored closely because you may ovulate a lot. And if you ovulate a lot and you're trying to get pregnant, then we're looking at twins. If you see triplets, not fraternal triplets out there, chances are, not always, but for the most part, chances are they were on some kind of a fertility medication, because triplets are very, very rare. To ovulate 3 ova in a single month, at the same time, that's probably somebody taking drugs who has had difficulty being pregnant. So there's some risks in that, but otherwise, medications can be useful in those kinds of things. The second piece is intrauterine insemination. This may be used for those where the husband has either a low sperm count or low mobility, things like that. They're also, so they'll take the sperm, and instead of having it delivered naturally, they'll actually bring it all the way into the uterus, or possibly into the fallopian tube. They'll inject it directly in order to get the best possible result, right? You get the most concentrated amount into the right area at the right time. And so that's possible. Also, any person that's using a sperm donation center, where they are maybe a single woman is trying to conceive, and she, or a lesbian couple or things like that, you have those issues there as well. So that has certain questions based on the scenario in which you're talking. Again, with a married couple, I don't see a problem with that. It's just putting the right pieces in the right place and removing some barriers. With a single woman, you start to say, well, gee, don't kids deserve their father too? And what they've found, it's very, very interesting. Now that we've gotten at least 20, 30 years behind us in this, they're finding that children born from donor sperm act much like children who are adopted, in that they want to find out who their biological parents actually are. And they go on quests to they want to know who they are. What do they look like? One guy, and there are ways that they can find this out. The organizations usually keep records for medical purposes in case something is drastically wrong, or it's a genetic defect or something like that shows up in your 30s and they need to find out. So depending on the organization that you're using, the bank that you're using, they'll keep records. They all definitely, a lot of them keep records because people go designer shopping, I want a guy who's 6'1" or above, and he's blonde-haired and blue-eyed and scores 1,400 on his IQ and all this stuff. Now, today, you laugh, but designer babies are in. This is what people do. And today, all they can do really right now is increase the odds by using the gamete from a donor who has those characteristics. It doesn't guarantee anything. Nobody's going into the lab and splicing together a DNA molecule that guarantees that you can use this. They are, however, sometimes they'll use IUI if you have, say, 3 girls and you want a boy. And what they'll do is they'll separate the male and the female sperm prior to insemination and only inject now the male sperm to almost guarantee that you'll have a male child. Again, this costs money, so you're going to have to really want it. But people are willing to pay given that. So that's intrauterine insemination. There can be some complications with that. In vitro fertilization, this is the one that's in vitro, from the Latin in the glass, in the vial. Okay, this is where we take usually the woman is given a significant amount of fertility drugs in order to ovulate, right? So she ovulates 5, 10, 15 eggs. It depends on how the woman responds. And they collect those, and they put them in a dish, and they take the man's sperm, and they fertilize the eggs in the dish. So it's outside the body, it's in the dish, in vitro. And then from that, they will reinsert the fertilized egg into the woman and allow that to run its course, embed, and go on. Gamete intralopian transfer is another where they will take the egg, they'll take the sperm, but they won't mix them in the dish. They'll actually put them in the intrafallopian tubes and allow them to fertilize. And then, of course, you have surrogacy, where you bring in a third party in order to carry the child or something to that effect. So those are the kind of broad views of what happens, or types of assisted reproductive technologies. And they all have different levels of moral compunction. And again, the reason why I bring this up is because the situations change based on the actors in the situation itself. Our technology has run headlong in front of our ethics on these. And there are a lot of cases that are showing up, just like with any law, with any ideology, there are a lot of cases showing up that nobody ever thought about, and it's becoming a difficult. So the first problem that we want to look at, especially with some of the medical drugs and IVF, is overfertilization before implantation. You've got a bunch of eggs. Okay, now remember, IVF is expensive, $10,000 to $20,000 per attempt. It requires at least 2 medical procedures for the woman. One, first of all, she has to be examined by the doctor. She's been given hormone-inducing pills in order to have her ovulate multiple eggs. And those have to be harvested, and that happens surgically in some way, shape, or form. So that's one procedure. And then, once those eggs are harvested, then they have to be fertilized, and they have to be reinserted, reimplanted. That's at least a second procedure. So there's a lot of technology and a lot of downtime, and especially the surgical part of grabbing the eggs is a difficult thing. So what is the easier way to do it? You give her a lot of drugs, you harvest a lot of eggs, and now you don't have to go back in if the first time we try to get you pregnant doesn't work, right? That's what you do. It's much simpler. She doesn't have to go through a third surgery or a fourth or things like that. Okay, so you have all of these eggs. What do you do with them? Now, you can freeze the eggs. You don't have to use them right away. However, freezing eggs has limited success. Eggs tend to not last very well. Sperm, on the other hand, you can freeze it for a long time. That's why sperm banks are so plentiful, because it doesn't seem to bother them so much. But the eggs, you don't have a very good success rate. So if you freeze a bunch of the ova, you run the risk of trying a second or a third time with damaged ova, which won't produce a baby because they're damaged by the freezing process. So what most fertility specialists do is they take all of the eggs and they fertilize all of them. So now you have 5, 6, 7, 8 eggs that are all fertilized. Now they're not going to put 8, they're not going to do an Octomom thing. Matter of fact, the doctor who did Octomom was censured. And Octomom did have IVF, so it wasn't that, I would have assumed that maybe she took a bunch of bunch of medication, ovulated too much, and then that was why she got 8 children. No, she had 8 eggs implanted in her. And the doctor was censured for that. He shouldn't have even done that. That's way too dangerous, okay? It's just insane. But what doctors will do is they will take the eggs, they'll implant some, and they'll freeze the rest. Now remember, even in natural occurring pregnancies, 40 to 50% of fertilized eggs spontaneously abort themselves. So it's not like this, not like every fertilized egg always ends up in a child. It's not that high a success rate. A lot do, but a lot don't. And because of that, we see 40 to 50% attrition of IVF embryos as well. just in the fertilization process. Doesn't matter, they're not going to make it. Okay? So what the doctor is doing is, it's a lot of money. He's hedging his bets. He will fertilize them all. He'll take 5 or 4 maybe, and he'll put the rest in a freezer. Because once the egg is fertilized, it can be stored in cryogenic storage. Boom. Right? Freeze them there. So that's what we have, multiple IVF embryos. Now you've got an issue. Okay? Now you've got an issue. Because when you have these eggs, you have 2 other choices that you have to deal with. One is, how many do you implant at a time? How many? Because, usually, sometimes you see 3 or 4 implanted at a time, with the doctor saying probably half of those won't take, or maybe 3 of them won't take, or maybe all 4 of them won't take, and then we'll go back to the freezer and try again. But what if they all do take? So your first question, and again, good people who are Christians who want to have children approach IVF and they haven't thought about the question of how many do we do this with and how often do we try? That's the first question. The second question is, what do you do with the human beings that you've created? What happens to those other ones? Now, I said implantation of multiple IVF embryos. And then the last thing is, if, say, the doctor implants 3 or 4, okay, how many of you have ever known anybody who's had quads? Hardly. You have? That's impressive. When were they born? In other words, were they premature when they were born? They didn't go 36 weeks. They're in college now. So, do you know how much they weighed or anything like that? Yeah, usually they're 2 to 3 months premature with 4. There's just not enough room. I mean, let's face it, you know, and the mother only has so many resources upon which she can give to her children, and the body tends to protect itself, so they will start birth early and things like that. So because of this, and because of the dangers to the child, what a lot of fertility guys will do is they will ask for what they euphemistically call a selective reduction. Oh, you're pregnant with 4 children. We're going to take a look, and we will remove 2. So basically, you'll have abortions. You'll remove 2 of the babies or 3 of the babies in order, you know, if you only want 1, we'll take 3. And so, again, we have good people who want to get pregnant, and then they look around and they go, oh my gosh, we have 4 children. And the doctor says, if you keep all 4, you probably will lose all 4. They'll probably spontaneously abort themselves by month 5, and none of them will survive. So which ones do you want? But who put the babies in that situation to begin with? It was the doctor who chose to implant 4 embryos, right? Okay, so one of the questions that people need to ask when they start looking at these things is, first of all, what happens to the humans in the dish? Okay, you've got 8 embryos, 10 embryos, whatever it is, that are fertilized. They have a new genetic structure. We already agreed in the abortion section that these are people. These are human beings. Maybe at the very earliest stages of development, they are human beings. And you have 8 of them. You say implant 2 because I don't want to do the selective reduction thing. Okay. Are you willing to carry twins? Yes, I'm willing to carry. If you're willing to carry twins, we'll implant 2. And it's going to cost you more money. Realize if we fail that we have to go back and do it again and go back and do it again. You may only get 1, you may get 2, we don't know. But what happens to the others? What do you do with them? And most people haven't talked through this. They haven't thought about what happens to all of the extra embryos. That is the mother and father's, that is the child of their product of their conception. What do we do with them? Do we leave? And usually there's three ways that they approach it. You can either A, leave them in cold storage for a while, right? Just leave them there. Well, the problem with that is that costs money every month. The cryogenic lab charges you for storing your embryos. And you got to pay for that. How many years are you willing to pay for that? What if you have the twins and you say, that's enough, I can't handle it anymore? Now what do you do with them? That's the first thing. And how many children are you willing to risk when you have this? Maybe you've started late. A lot of in vitro and things like that are women who are in either perimenopause or menopausal because they wanted to get their careers going first. It was interesting. There was in the New York subway system, in the New York medical system, there was a reproductive center where women would come in and they've 30 to 35, and they'd want to start having children, maybe 36, 37, that kind of thing. And the doctors would come in and say, ma'am, do you understand that 55 is a very normal age to begin to enter into menopause when you cease being fertile? And that a lot of millions and millions of women are menopausal at 55, which means that they start perimenopause about 45. Okay. She goes, but you also have to realize that 45 is also a fairly consistent age to be menopausal, which means that you enter into perimenopause maybe at 35. After 35 years old, a woman's chance of spontaneous abortion, miscarriage, or birth defects goes up exponentially from 35 on up. Anything after 35 is considered by definition a high-risk pregnancy. We have been told that, you live your life, you get your career going, and later on when you can afford it, you'll have children. And these women were all walking in and they're saying, how come nobody told me that my time was up before I even got the chance to start? So this reproduction center would actually put ads in the New York subway trying to get this message across, and I think some women's groups made them take it down and that kind of thing. But this is, again, this is the brave new world in which we live. And when you start doing this at 45, are you willing to go through IVF a second time because you have frozen embryos? So if I'm a Christian, I'm going to work with my doctor and I'm going to make sure, now if you're a Christian, this isn't necessarily always wrong. But if you're going to do IVF, you have to be very, very restrictive and hold some pretty hard parameters. Only fertilize the number of eggs you're going to implant, or if you plan on being pregnant more than once, and you better really think about that because that child is there whether you change your mind or not. The best argument, I would say, only fertilize the number of eggs that you're going to implant and only implant those number of eggs of the children that you're willing to carry. That makes sense, because what do you do with the extra embryos? Now there is, and what costs are you willing to bear? How long are you willing to keep it in cold storage, for example? Now there is an organization. How many of you have heard of the Operation Snowflake? Okay, just a couple. Organization like this is nightlight.org. There are Christian organizations out there that allow you to adopt someone else's fertilized embryo. So if you're struggling with infertility and you want to have a child, there are Christian doctors who will help you by allowing you to adopt someone else's frozen embryo, put it into your uterus. You can have the full pregnancy, you can have the child. The only difference is it isn't your genetic makeup, it's the genetic makeup of the donor couple. But some Christians like this because it rescues these embryos who will basically not survive otherwise. Now, some people will, what happens is a lot of people will keep them in cold storage and for a while, and then it becomes, as life gets busier, less important, or they can't make a decision, or they really don't want children, they don't know what to do with the embryo, and they just simply stop paying the bill. And now it's the lab's decision. So you've offered your children off to a third party, whether they should dispose of them or keep them alive at their own cost. And that's a problem. You can see where that could be a problem. So stuff like this is an interesting alternative to, again, you're the birth mother, it'll be your child, and the odds of the biological parents trying to come and take such children away are far less than even regular adoptive approaches. Really, when you start talking about in vitro fertilization and what we should do, here's the question. How many people do you want to fit into a lifeboat? Should we allow more people into the lifeboat than is safe? Similarly, should we allow more fertilized eggs than we are willing to bear at any one point in time? That's the way to do it. So that I think that's an important analogy in order to start thinking about these things as you do it. And we don't talk about this stuff. Here's the thing. I hear a lot of Christians talking about IVF and the miracle of life and things like that. But nobody in the church, who's warning them about these? Because the doctors, a lot of times, they won't realize that you're going to have 8 frozen eggs. This is their standard operating procedure. This is what they do. And they'll say, well, we'll probably implant 4, but you'll probably lose 2, and so you'll have twins. And they don't talk about the other 8 in cold storage because that's just easier for them, And Christians don't know that these options are out there, that there's these issues, that there's these complications. How do we talk to the people? Why isn't the church doing more in order to inform these couples who are struggling with this, that these issues exist from 13 years, 14 years. Half of the patients are killed without giving their consent were over the age of 80. So what do? It's the old people, right? Oh, you're just going to die anyway sooner or later. The study found 2/3 of them were in the hospital and were not suffering from a terminal disease such as cancer. They were just old. This is a study that was done in the Journal of Medical Ethics, by the way, by Steve Dowdy. In about 4 out of 5 cases, death was not discussed with patients subjected to involuntary euthanasia because they were either in a coma, they were diagnosed with dementia, or because doctors decided it would not be in their best interest to discuss the matters with them. So in 4 out of 5 cases, basically the patient had no one to stick up for them, so the doctor said, oh, we'll just euthanize them. Wow. Very often, doctors would not even inform family members of the plans to lethally inject a relation because they considered it a medical decision to be made by themselves alone, and so the report publishes. That's 13 years of euthanasia in Belgium and Netherlands. What's that look like? Well, here's the graph. You can see what happens. It starts off in 2002. Okay, maybe you get a couple of people say, oh, I didn't know that this law was in existence, right? And you see it grows a little bit. It levels off a little bit 2004, 2005. But then look what happens. Why are more and more people dying via euthanasia year after year after year? Because it's easy to do so, and the easier it becomes, the more people we can get rid of. Save the costs on the hospital, save the labor, right? Just kill them. Just kill them. This is where euthanasia leads. And by the way, it's not only in the Netherlands and Belgium. Oregon has had euthanasia now since 2003. In Oregon, it reports that reported assisted suicide deaths have increased by more than 306% since the first year that it was legalized. So it's growing in Oregon. Complications tend to occur during euthanasia because the doctor is giving very powerful drugs to people who are not physicians and they don't know how to administer it. One person said that, matter of fact, Patrick Matheny received his lethal prescription from an Oregon Health Science University through Federal Express. So the doctor didn't even hand it to him. So he just got it in a box. He had difficulty when he tried to take the drugs 4 months later. So he waited 4 months even before doing it. People are thinking about this. They could change their mind. So if you're having difficulty administering something, his brother assisted him. His brother-in-law, Joe Hayes, said he had to help Matheny die. Now, does that mean that Matheny maybe changed his mind and Joe helped him by shoving the pills down his throat? We don't know. Matter of fact, many patients are euthanized in this way and desire for help, and many of them have severe side effects, some of which, sometimes the person takes the drug, they're having such severe side effects that the family rushes them to the ER to get them fixed because they're in such pain. According to according to the people, it doesn't just go smoothly for everyone. Dr. Hedberg said, we don't know exactly how he helped this person swallow, whether it was putting a feeding tube down or whatever, but he wasn't prosecuted for the crime. Assisted suicide requests in Oregon, physicians not present for the majority of deaths, only 21% of the time when euthanasia is administered, the physicians aren't even there. So again, abuses can be rampant. You can say that your father wanted to be euthanized, but how do we know you're not lying? Nobody's there to check up on it. 9 reported cases of requested euthanasia due to financial concerns. In Oregon, 36.2% of the people euthanized were on Medicare or Medicaid. They were poor. And an additional 0.9%, almost another full percent. So over a third of people who were euthanized in Oregon were poor people who were worried about money or running out of money. So how does Oregon stack up? Well, here's the chart again with the Netherlands and Belgium, and here's Oregon on the top. It looks like it's following the same trajectory, huh? We just approved this law, ladies and gentlemen. Our Governor Brown just signed California to follow this curve. That's what's going to happen. We throw away our old people. We don't keep them. And that's a problem. John Jefferson Davis said, human life is sacred because God made man in his own image and likeness. This canopy of sacredness extends throughout man's life and is not simply limited to those times and circumstances when man happens to be strong, independent, healthy, and fully conscious of his relationship to others. I completely agree. There is an inherent dignity and worth in all human beings, and we need to recognize that. And in all of these situations, reproductive services, where we're shelving embryos, in euthanasia, where we're eliminating old people, in abortion, where we're eliminating children, it's all about our personal comforts. It's all about our individual convenience as opposed to understanding and reflecting the image of God, which makes all of us equal. And if we don't do something about it, God help us. Okay, questions? Yes, ma'am, Beverly. Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. Cruel and unusual, because that's the constitutional requirement, that the punishment cannot be cruel and unusual.
So the courts have said now we can't carry out the death penalty.
Right.
We have made this rule about euthanasia, but we're not concerned about how painful it is, if it's cruel and unusual. So it seems to me that the people who have committed crimes and are have their cases adjudicated
Right.
are being treated better than people.
Okay. I agree. And this goes, my answer to you is exactly the same as the last time. Those that are pro-abortion and anti-death penalty and pro-euthanasia hold to those views because the ultimate trump card is the will of the individual, not the outcome itself. It's the person who wants to die should be allowed to die. The person who doesn't want to be pregnant shouldn't have to be pregnant. The person who doesn't want to die, even though he's a criminal who took someone else's life, and by the way, that other person didn't want to die either, shouldn't have to die. It is the goal of those individuals to say, my will be done. Now, where does that sound familiar?
But the state, because the state is taking
Right,
the side of the criminal and
right.
less concerned about.
Well, the state would argue that, no, we've tried to enforce the death penalty. The judges won't let us. The judges in the euthanasia decision has said a person has autonomy, although suicide is still illegal. It is illegal to commit suicide in most states, yet physician committed the suicide because he feels bad. Or what they do is they project. All of this is about projecting feelings. It's, I don't want to be the blithering person drooling in front of everybody else who doesn't remember my own name, who doesn't remember my own family, and who has to wear diapers. I don't want that to be me, so we better pass the euthanasia laws in case that is me, so I can deal with it ahead of time. But they don't think that that has ramifications and dangers associated with it because it's only about me. All of these views are very selfish. And that's the biggest problem with them, is they don't say, what about the nephew who wants to inherit the grandfather's money? And so he says, yeah, I've been living with grandpa for 6 months. He wants to die, in a dignified manner. Because that's going to happen. I mean, it doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure that out. That's happened all throughout history, usually at the end of a knife, not necessarily through a physician's pill or an injection in the arm. It's going to happen. There's going to be people who change their mind. And the helper is going to shove it down their throat anyway. It's going to be the people who can't speak for themselves and are going to be euthanized, as we see is happening in the Netherlands and Belgium. There is a girl who wants to be euthanized because she feels she can't live anymore, not because she's medically sick at all. And that